In this video, you'll be learning how to complete Guided Practice 5, which covers how to write the for loop. We'll show you how to set up a for loop that has an unknown bounds to start with, and then we'll show you a for loop that can produce rows and columns. You can see here that I have started a new project in NetBeans. I've named it Guided Practice 5. And I've already created an import statement. We are going to import the scanner object or the scanner class so that we can create an instance of the class and use it in our program. So to get started here, we'll go ahead and create that scanner instance. So we've got our new object in, which is of type scanner. And then we want to put some output to the user to ask them to input how many numbers they would like to enter. Looks like we got two sets of parentheses there, huh? All right. So that's the prompt for the user. Now we're going to want to create a variable that's of int type that we'll call count. And we'll use that then to identify the input from the user. So it'll be count equals to in dot next int. Now the next thing we'll do is create a couple of variables that we'll use in our for loop. We're going to have an int named num and one named sum, and we'll initialize sum with the value here of 0. And then we will create the header for our for loop where we'll have int I equal to 0. And then our bounds is going to be the count variable. So the number that the user typed in from the keyboard is how many numbers they wanted to enter. So we want this for loop to run as long as we're less than that count, and you always want to use the less than here because remember that we're starting our counter at 0, and if we were to put it equals to count, then we would go one loop too far. And then we'll use an increment operator to move us towards the bounds. So count is the bounds. Once we reach a value that is not less than count, then the for loop will end. Since we're starting at 0, then it's the increment operator that's moving us towards the bounds. In the for loop, we'll go ahead and create a prompt here and ask the user to enter a value. And then we'll take the value that the user enters and we'll assign it to our num variable. Oops, we got int there instead of in. So num is equal to the input from the user, next int. And then we want to keep a running total here, so we'll take our sum variable and we'll use a plus equals operator to keep adding the value that's typed in by the user. So once the loop ends, we reach the count value, then it's going to escape from the for loop, and then we'll go ahead and output what that sum is. Okay, so we have a string there that reads the sum of the numbers is space, and then we'll go ahead and display the final sum value. to the screen. So let's go ahead and run this. We get our prompt here as to how many numbers that we want to enter. So let's say we'll enter 4 numbers. And now we're prompted to put in a number. So let's go with 34 and then 12 and then 53 and 6. Okay, there's our 4 numbers, and then the for loop ends, and we get the total, the sum then of those 4 numbers, which is 105. So that's a pretty easy for loop. Now we didn't have a predefined bounds in the sense that we didn't have a fixed value that we put in there in the for header for when, what value we were shooting for, but we were able to determine that based on having the user put in their value and assigning that to our count variable, and then using the count variable as the bounds. And again, just remember that you always want to be 1 less than that value to have the correct number of loops occurring. And then again, we're using the I++, so the increment operator, to increase the I as we're going through the loop. So we start at 0, and in this case we did 0, 1, 2, 3, and that was our 4 loops through the for loop. Summed up each time a number was entered, added it to our sum variable, and then output the result. Now the next thing that we want to do here is show you how to use a nested for loop so that you can create a series of rows and columns. So we'll start off with the outer for loop, and we're going to create an integer named row to identify how many rows then that we want to create in our looping process. So go rows less than 5, which that should tell you then that we're going to end up with 5 rows. And then we want to increment then that row variable each time through the loop. Then inside of that for loop, we create a second for loop now, where we have int column, and that's also going to be less than 5, so we'll loop through that loop 5 times and increment it each time that we loop through. So that's the basis for our nested for loop. We've got an outer for loop here that's going to run 5 times. So on the first time through the loop, the outer loop, then we'll run the inner for loop, which will put in its 5 values. Then we'll escape back out to the outer for loop. It'll increment to the second row, then come back to the inner for loop, get 5 more values, and then escape from that, back to the outer for loop, next row, next set of 5 columns, etc., until we have 5 rows that consist of 5 columns. Forgot to put our variable there. So also, I didn't point it out previously, just make sure you're aware of it though, that we've got essentially 3 different components that determine our loop in the for header, and each one is separated by a semicolon. So it's very important that you have your initialization of your counter variable, semicolon, and then your bounds expression, which is in this case row less than 5, semicolon, and then the increment statement. You don't have to have a semicolon after the increment statement, but those are the 3 components that you need to have in the header of the for loop. And like I said, the first 2 are separated by, or terminated really, by a semicolon. All right, so inside of our nested for loop, now we want to do some output. And we're only going to use print here. And what we'll do is we'll just add the value of the row and the column. And then concatenate to that the escape T, which you might recall is a tab symbol. So that way we'll have tab spacing between each of the values that are being printed. And then outside of the nested for loop, we want to go ahead and do our line feed. So we'll do a system.out.print and use the \n escape character here. Another typo. And as I'm looking at this, I just realized we didn't initialize our two counters here. So we want to start each of those off with 0. That's why we had the red squigglies underneath there. Anytime you got red squigglies, you got trouble. Okay, let's go ahead and run this. And we'll see our results down below here. So let's take a look at how we got this result here. So we started out in the outer for loop, row was 0, column was 0, and so we added the two values together, the row and the column. We got the 0 right here. Then we continued in the nested for loop, because we want to run this for loop until we get to 4 essentially. And so then we got row 0 plus column 1. And then we got row 0 plus column 2. And then we got row 0 plus column 3. And then we got row 0 plus column 4. And at that point then, we had reached the bounds of the nested for loop. So we went back outside of that for loop, created a line feed, and then went back, incremented the outer for loop. So now it's a value of 1. And came back to the nested for loop where column now is reinitialized at 0, so 1 plus 0 is 1. And then again we ran 4 times through the nested for loop here, so then we get the next values here, so it's always 1 plus whatever column is. So column was incremented to 1, so 1 plus 1, column incremented to 2, 1 plus 2, column was incremented to 3, 1 plus 3, and then column was incremented to 4, so 1 plus 4 and the 5 is the output. Okay, and then again, we had reached the bounds of the nested for loop, went back and got another line feed, and then incremented row again, and just repeated the process. And so just kept incrementing by 1 here as we went down, because that's essentially how the outer loop was going, 1 by 1. But then each time internally, as we created the values in the row, we were actually creating those values by running through the for loop its maximum amount of times. That's a good example then of how to set up and use a nested for loop for creating tabular values. Now in this case here, we were simply adding the row and the column values. What I'd like you to do, or what to try and see if you can do, is to create a nested for loop like we just showed you, that creates this multiplication table that you see on the screen now. So that's it for this video. Until next time, happy coding.